Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight we're embarking on something truly special, a journey into the cradle of civilization itself. Before you settle in, take a moment to like this video if you find value in what we explore here, and subscribe if you haven't already. Drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. It's always fascinating to see our community spanning across the globe, united by our shared curiosity about the ancient world. Go ahead and dim the lights if you'd like, maybe adjust the volume to a comfortable level, and let's drift together into the distant past. Tonight, we're exploring the Sumerian kings, rulers of the world's first civilization, men whose reigns blur the line between history and mythology, between human achievement and divine intervention. Before there were presidents or emperors as we understand them, before Rome, before Greece, even before the pharaohs who built the pyramids, there were the kings of Sumer. These rulers governed the earliest known cities, developed the first writing system, created the world's oldest law codes, and built monuments that would influence human civilization for millennia to come. Their stories have been preserved on clay tablets written in wedge-shaped cuneiform script, discovered buried beneath the sands of Iraq, waiting for thousands of years to tell us their tales. The Sumerian king list is one of the most fascinating and controversial documents to survive from the ancient world. It's a text that attempts to chronicle every ruler who ever held power in southern Mesopotamia, from the moment when, as the text itself claims, kingship descended from heaven, all the way through centuries of recorded history. But here's where things get interesting and deeply strange. The king list doesn't distinguish between rulers who definitely existed and those who might be purely mythological. It presents them all in the same matter-of-fact manner, as if a king who ruled for 36,000 years is just as historical as one who ruled for 36 years. This document, written and rewritten across centuries, has puzzled historians since its discovery in the early 20th century. Multiple copies have been found, each slightly different, but all sharing the same basic structure and the same impossible chronology. The most complete version, known as the Weld-Blundell Prism, sits in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. It's an 8-inch tall clay prism covered on all four sides with columns of cuneiform text, listing king after king, dynasty after dynasty, in what claims to be an unbroken chain of sovereignty stretching back to the very beginning of human civilization. The document begins with a simple but profound statement that has echoed through the ages. After kingship descended from heaven, the first seat of power was established. From that point forward, the text tells us, kingship moved from city to city across the Mesopotamian plain, never shared, always singular. According to the king list theology, only one city could hold legitimate power at any given time. This was propaganda, of course, a political tool used by later rulers to legitimize their own authority by connecting themselves to an unbroken chain of divinely sanctioned kings stretching back to the dawn of time. Modern archaeology tells a different story. We know now that many of these dynasties ruled simultaneously, competing for resources and territory in the fractious landscape of early Mesopotamia. But the king list smooths out all this complexity, presenting history as an orderly succession, each dynasty falling only to be replaced by the next chosen city. It's a beautiful lie, and one that tells us as much about how the Sumerians wanted to see themselves as it does about their actual history. What makes the Sumerian king list truly special? What sets it apart from every other king list or chronicle from the ancient world is how it handles the transition from mythology to history. Most ancient cultures drew a clear line between their mythical age and their historical period. Not the Sumerians. Their king list slides gradually from the clearly impossible to the plausible, from kings who ruled for tens of thousands of years to kings whose reigns lasted mere decades, with no acknowledgement that anything strange is happening. It's as if the document itself is showing us the slow process by which gods became men, by which divine kingship gradually transformed into human governance. Scholars have spent over a century trying to understand this document. Is it meant to be taken literally? Is it allegory? Is it propaganda? Is it genuine history corrupted by oral tradition and religious belief? The answer is probably yes to all of these questions. The Sumerian king list is a complex document serving multiple purposes, and to understand the kings it describes, we need to approach it with both respect for its historical value and awareness of its mythological dimension. The antediluvian kings, when rulers were more than human. The Sumerian king list begins in the most extraordinary way imaginable. It doesn't start with a conquest or a battle or even a particularly distinguished human being. Instead, it begins before the flood, in a time when kings were not quite human, when they ruled not for years but for epochs, when mortality itself operated under different rules than it does today. According to the king list, when kingship first descended from heaven, the royal throne was placed in the city of Eridu. This detail is significant. Eridu was considered by the Sumerians to be the oldest city in the world, the place where civilization itself began. Archaeological evidence actually supports this claim to some degree. Eridu shows signs of continuous habitation stretching back to around 5000 BCE, making it one of the very oldest urban settlements ever discovered. The Sumerians were right to see it as ancient. Even to them it was ancient. The first king, according to the list, was named Alulim. He ruled from Eridu for 28,800 years. Just let that number sink in for a moment. 28,000 years. To put that in perspective, the entire span of recorded human history, from the invention of writing to the present day, is only about 5,000 years. Alulim alone supposedly ruled for nearly 6 times that long. His successor, Al-Algar, did even better, reigning for 36,000 years. The numbers continue in this vein, fantastical beyond belief, yet recorded with the same bureaucratic precision the Sumerians used for documenting grain inventories and land transactions. There were 8 kings in total before the flood, ruling from 5 different cities. Eridu had 2 kings. Bad Tibira had 3. Larag had 1, as did Zimbir and Shurupak. Together, these 8 kings ruled for a combined total of 241,200 years. The king list presents this information straightforwardly, with no hint that there's anything unusual about these numbers, no indication that the scribes who wrote and copied this text generation after generation found anything odd about kings who lived longer than mountains. What are we to make of these antediluvian rulers? Modern scholars have proposed numerous explanations, though none can be proven definitively. Some suggest the numbers might be purely symbolic, representing not years but something else entirely, perhaps months or seasons or some unit of time we no longer understand. Mathematical analysis has revealed some intriguing patterns in the numbers, which could imply they're based on sexagesimal calculations, the base 60 number system the Sumerians used for astronomy and mathematics. If we interpret these figures through that lens, converting from sexagesimal to decimal base, the results, while still extraordinary, begin to approach something closer to human possibility. Another interpretation suggests the antediluvian kings might not represent individuals at all, but rather entire dynasties compressed into single legendary figures. Under this reading, each name could stand for a succession of rulers whose separate reigns merged in cultural memory. This would explain the impossible longevity while preserving some kernel of historical truth. Alulim, in this view, might represent not one king, but 10, 20, or 50 rulers whose names were lost but whose collective reign was remembered and attributed to a single founding figure. There's also a religious dimension that can't be ignored. The Sumerians believed that in the earliest days of the world, humans lived much closer to the gods. The divine and mortal realms had not yet separated into the distinct categories we recognize today. Kings from this era were thought to be semi-divine beings, literally different from the humans who came after them. their extreme longevity wasn't a metaphor or a mistake. It was meant to be understood as literal truth, evidence of how fundamentally different the world was before the gods sent the flood to punish humanity and reset creation. The flood itself is described in the king list with characteristic Sumerian understatement. After listing the 8 antediluvian kings and their combined reign of nearly 250,000 years, the text simply says, "Then the flood swept over." That's it. No details about why it happened, no description of the destruction, no Noah figure saving the remnants of civilization. Just a plain statement of fact, as if to say, you know about the flood, everyone knows about the flood, there's no need to elaborate. And then, after that brief acknowledgement, the text continues with a new section. After the flood had swept over, and kingship had descended from heaven, the kingship was in Kish. And with those words, we transition from the world before to the world after, from the time of superhuman kings to something approaching recognizable history. But even in this new post-flood world, the reigns remain impossibly long, at least at first. The first king of Kish, Jushur, ruled for 1,200 years. Still fantastical, but notice the magnitude of the change. We've gone from rulers who governed for tens of thousands of years to one who ruled for merely over a millennium. The trend continues downward. The next king ruled for 960 years, the one after that for 670 years. With each generation the numbers shrink, becoming gradually more human, more plausible, more like the kind of reign lengths we actually find in historical records. This gradual decrease in reign lengths is one of the most striking features of the Sumerian king list. It's as if the document is showing us humanity slowly becoming more human, mortality gradually establishing its grip on royal dynasties, the divine essence that once suffused kingship slowly draining away as the world ages and settles into the patterns we recognize as normal. By the time we reach kings like Enmebarjesi and his son Akka of Kish, who ruled in the 27th century BCE, the reign lengths have come down to something almost believable. Enmebarjesi is credited with 900 years, still impossible but at least in the same general order of magnitude as human lifespans. And crucially, Enmebarjesi is the first king in the entire Sumerian king list who can be confirmed through independent archaeological evidence. His name appears on artifacts and inscriptions that can be dated to his supposed time period, providing our first solid link between the mythological world of the king list and actual historical reality. The antediluvian kings, whatever historical reality they might or might not reflect, served an important function in Sumerian thought. They established the idea that kingship itself was divine in origin, not a human invention, but a gift from the gods. They created a template for what a king should be, a bridge between heaven and earth, a figure who ruled not just through strength or cleverness but through divine mandate. Every king who came after them could claim, implicitly or explicitly, to be heir to this ancient tradition, to carry forward a form of governance that had existed since before the flood, since the very beginning of the world. These mythical rulers also served as a reminder of humanity's fall from an earlier, greater state. The Sumerians, like many ancient cultures, believed that the world was slowly declining from a golden age. The impossibly long reigns of the antediluvian kings were evidence of that lost greatness, a time when humans were stronger, lived longer, accomplished more. Every generation was a step further from that perfect beginning, which made the work of preserving civilization, maintaining temples, upholding justice, all the more important. If the world was in decline, then kings had a sacred duty to slow that decline, to preserve what could be preserved of the ancient glory. Gilgamesh of Uruk, the hero king who conquered death and failed of all the names inscribed in the Sumerian king list, none resonates across the millennia quite like Gilgamesh. He stands at the crucial transition point between mythology and history, between the age of legends and the age of verifiable events. The king list credits him with 126 years as the 5th king of Uruk, following his father Lugalbanda. That number alone tells us we're still partly in the realm of myth. No human has ever lived 126 years, let alone ruled for that entire span. Yet Gilgamesh, unlike the antediluvian kings before him, was almost certainly a real person, a historical ruler whose achievements became so legendary that he transcended history entirely to become something more, a figure of epic poetry, religious devotion, and timeless myth. The city he ruled, Uruk, was one of the great urban centers of the ancient world. At its height around 2700 BCE, during what most scholars believe was roughly Gilgamesh's time based on archaeological evidence and textual cross-references, Uruk was likely one of the largest cities on Earth, with estimates of its population ranging into the tens of thousands. Its massive walls, which the Epic of Gilgamesh credits to its hero king, can still be traced in archaeological remains. These walls stretched for 6 miles, encompassing the entire city, and stood in places nearly 50 feet high. Their construction would have required a massive workforce and represented an engineering feat that few civilizations of that era could match. If Gilgamesh did indeed commission these walls, as tradition claims, then that alone would secure his place in history. But it's not the walls that made Gilgamesh immortal, it's the story. The Epic of Gilgamesh, which exists in multiple versions across various languages and time periods, tells the tale of a king who was 2/3 god and 1/3 human, possessed of superhuman strength and terrible pride. The epic opens by describing Gilgamesh as a tyrant, a king so powerful and so arrogant that he oppresses his own people, claiming the right to sleep with every new bride before her husband, exhausting the young men of Uruk with endless building projects, generally making himself unbearable despite his glory and might. The people of Uruk pray to the gods for relief, and the gods respond by creating Enkidu, a wild man who lives among the animals, ignorant of civilization, pure and innocent in his strength. Enkidu is civilized by a temple priestess named Shamhat, who teaches him the ways of humans through 7 days and nights of lovemaking, after which the animals no longer recognize him as one of their own. He travels to Uruk to challenge the tyrant king, and when the two meet, they fight. The battle is tremendous, shaking the very walls of the city, but Gilgamesh proves slightly stronger. Yet in their contest they recognize each other's worth. Instead of becoming enemies, they become the closest of friends, brothers in all but blood. Together, Gilgamesh and Enkidu embark on a series of adventures that form the core of the epic's early sections. They travel to the cedar forest to slay Humbaba, the terrifying guardian of the trees, despite knowing that this creature was placed there by the gods themselves. They kill the bull of heaven, which the goddess Ishtar sends to destroy Uruk after Gilgamesh spurns her romantic advances, insulting her in the process with a litany of her past lovers and how she destroyed each one. These exploits make Gilgamesh the greatest hero of his age, celebrated in songs and stories, feared by his enemies, beloved by his people despite his earlier tyranny. But the gods are not pleased. They decide that someone must pay for the death of Humbaba and the Bull of Heaven, both of whom were under divine protection. They choose Enkidu to die. The wild man falls ill, and over 12 days he gradually weakens and perishes, leaving Gilgamesh devastated. For the first time in his life, the king understands mortality. He has seen men die before, of course, sent many to their deaths in battle, but this is different. This is his friend, his brother, the one person who was his equal, and now Enkidu is gone, and Gilgamesh understands with terrible clarity that he too will die someday, that all his strength and glory will end in the same clay that now holds Enkidu's corpse. This realization transforms Gilgamesh. He can no longer accept the inevitability of death. He abandons his throne and wanders into the wilderness, seeking Utnapishtim, the only human who ever achieved immortality, the survivor of the great flood who was granted eternal life by the gods. Gilgamesh's journey takes him to the ends of the earth, through darkness and over mountains no mortal should cross, past guardians who try to turn him back, always, driven forward by his desperate need to escape the fate of all humans. When he finally finds Utnapishtim, living in a paradise beyond the waters of death, the immortal man tells him that his quest is hopeless. The gods granted Utnapishtim immortality as a unique exception, a response to the specific circumstances of the flood. It was a one-time gift, never to be repeated. The gods will not grant Gilgamesh the same blessing, no matter how great his achievements or how desperate his need. Death is the fate of all humans, even kings, even heroes. This is simply how the world works, but Utnapishtim takes pity on Gilgamesh's anguish and tells him of a plant growing at the bottom of the sea, a plant that can restore youth though not grant true immortality. It's something, at least a way to reset the clock, if not to stop it completely. Gilgamesh dives to the ocean floor and retrieves the plant, planning to bring it back to Uruk and test it on an old man to see if it works before using it himself. But on the journey home, while Gilgamesh bathes in a pool, a serpent smells the plant's sweet fragrance, emerges from the water, and eats it. The snake immediately sheds its skin, renewed and refreshed, then slithers away. Gilgamesh is left with nothing. He returns to Uruk empty-handed, having failed in his quest for immortality, having lost even the consolation prize that might have given him a few more years. But something has changed in him. He no longer rages against death. Instead, he looks at the walls of his city with new eyes, seeing in them a different kind of immortality. These walls will stand for generations, centuries even. They are his legacy, more lasting than any merely human life could be. The epic ends with Gilgamesh showing the walls to his companion, describing their magnificence, finding peace in the understanding that a king's true immortality lies in what he builds and what he leaves behind. This is how the story goes in the standard Babylonian version of the epic, composed around 1300 BCE by a scribe named Sinleq-Unini. But the Epic of Gilgamesh didn't begin with Sinleq-Unini. It evolved over more than 1,000 years, growing from earlier Sumerian poems into the Akkadian epic we know today. 5 separate Sumerian poems about Gilgamesh existed before the unified epic was created. These shorter works told independent stories: Gilgamesh and Huwawa, Gilgamesh and the Bull of Heaven, Gilgamesh and Aga of Kish, Gilgamesh and Enkidu and the Netherworld, and the Death of Gilgamesh. Each of these poems was probably based on oral traditions that stretched back even further, perhaps to the lifetime of the actual historical Gilgamesh. Over centuries, these separate traditions were combined, elaborated and transformed, the historical king gradually becoming more and more legendary until he transcended history entirely. By the first millennium BCE, Gilgamesh was worshipped as a god of the underworld, a judge of the dead, his temples receiving offerings and prayers. The man had become a deity. But was there really a King Gilgamesh? Most historians generally agree that Gilgamesh was likely a historical king, though the evidence is indirect and requires careful interpretation. His name appears in the Sumerian king list, which places him as reigning after Lugalbanda and before Ur-Nunggal. His father Lugalbanda is also mentioned in separate Sumerian poems as a semi-divine figure, which could suggest that the royal family of Uruk cultivated legendary status even during their lifetimes, or that later traditions embellished their memory. More significantly, Gilgamesh is connected to Enmebaragisi of Kish in the historical record. Enmebaragisi is confirmed through contemporary inscriptions as a genuine historical figure, and he appears in later Sumerian texts that also mention Gilgamesh, suggesting they may have been contemporaries. This association, while not based on contemporary evidence naming both together, would place Gilgamesh and Enmebaragesi as possible contemporaries, or near contemporaries, rulers of rival cities during the early dynastic period. Additionally, the Tumul Chronicle, another Mesopotamian historical text, mentions Gilgamesh renovating a temple at Tumul near Nippur. Archaeological evidence confirms that this temple was indeed renovated during the early dynastic period, around the time Gilgamesh supposedly lived. So we have textual references, architectural evidence, and the testimony of the king list, all pointing toward a historical figure named Gilgamesh who ruled Uruk in roughly the 27th or 26th century BCE. What we can't confirm is anything about his personality, his adventures, or his quest for immortality. Those elements belong to the epic tradition, not to historical record. The real Gilgamesh was probably a successful warrior king who expanded Uruk's territory, reinforced or rebuilt its walls, fought wars with neighboring city-states, and maintained the temples of his city. He may have been particularly effective or charismatic, leaving an impression strong enough that stories about him continued to circulate long after his death. Over time, these stories grew and merged with older mythological themes, the historical king becoming a vehicle for expressing timeless human concerns about mortality, friendship, power, and the search for meaning. The Epic of Gilgamesh wrestles with questions that every civilization has faced. What does it mean to be human? How should we respond to death? What kind of legacy matters? Can anything we build or accomplish survive our own mortality? The epic's answer is both pessimistic and oddly comforting. No, we cannot escape death. All humans die, even the greatest heroes. But we can create things that outlast us. We can build walls, tell stories, make laws, plant gardens, raise children, create beauty that will endure after we're gone. That's the only immortality available to us, and the epic suggests it might be enough. Gilgamesh's influence on later literature cannot be overstated. Elements of his story appear in the Hebrew Bible, particularly in the flood narrative, which closely parallels the flood story Utnapishtim tells in the epic. The theme of a hero's quest for immortality echoes through Greek mythology. The intimate friendship between Gilgamesh and Enkidu foreshadows similar relationships in later literature, from Achilles and Patroclus to countless buddy narratives in modern fiction. The epic's preoccupation with mortality and meaning influenced Mesopotamian thought for thousands of years and continues to resonate with readers today. The historical Gilgamesh, if we can separate him from legend, probably ruled for perhaps 20 or 30 years, not the century and a quarter credited to him by the king list. Based on what we know of typical ancient Near Eastern royal reigns, this would be more consistent with human lifespans. He likely built or significantly rebuilt Uruk's walls, which archaeological evidence confirms were constructed during the early dynastic period. He fought wars with neighboring city-states, administered his territory, maintained temples, and eventually died. That should have been the end of it. But something about the man or his reign captured the Sumerian imagination so completely that his memory refused to fade. Stories accumulated around his name like sediment, layer upon layer, until the historical king disappeared entirely beneath the weight of legend, becoming instead a mirror in which human beings could see themselves reflected, their fears and hopes and questions about existence given form in the adventures of a hero who was almost, but not quite, a god. The post-flood dynasties and the nature of early kingship. After the flood swept over and kingship descended from heaven once more, the Sumerian king list tells us that power was established in the city of Kish. This marks the beginning of what historians call the early dynastic period, spanning roughly from 2900 to 2300 BCE. It's during this era that we transition from the purely legendary to the historically verifiable, though the line between the two remains blurry and contested. Kish was located in northern Sumer, near where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers come closest to each other, making it a natural center for trade and military control. The king list credits Kish with 23 rulers in its first dynasty, though the reign lengths, while shorter than the antediluvian kings, remain suspiciously long. The first king, Jushur, supposedly ruled for 1200 years, the second, Kulasinabel, for 960 years. These numbers gradually decrease through the dynasty, but even the last king, Agar, is credited with 625 years. Yet despite these impossible reign lengths, something has fundamentally changed. We're no longer dealing with quasi-divine beings from a lost golden age. These are recognizably human kings, ruling over actual cities, fighting wars with neighbors, building temples, administering justice. The supernatural has not disappeared from kingship. The gods still choose and support rulers, but the kings themselves are mortal, subject to defeat and death, their power dependent on military strength and political acumen as much as divine favor. The dynasty of Kish includes some fascinating names that hint at the complexity of early Mesopotamian politics. Etana, called the shepherd who ascended to heaven, is mentioned in the king list as ruling for 1500 years. Separate legends tell of how Etana, unable to have children, beseeched the gods for help. An eagle, whom Etana had saved from death, carried him up to heaven to obtain the plant of birth. This story, preserved in multiple versions, shows how even in this supposedly more historical period, legend and reality remained thoroughly intertwined. Etana was probably a real king, but the stories told about him transformed his reign into something mythological. The king list is structured around a principle of sequential sovereignty. According to its logic, power never divided among multiple cities. When one dynasty fell, kingship moved to a different city, where a new dynasty arose. Kish was defeated, we're told, and the kingship was taken to Eanna, which is Uruk. Uruk's dynasty includes Gilgamesh and his predecessors. After Uruk fell, power moved to Ur for its first dynasty, then to Awan, then back to Kish for a second dynasty, then to Hamazi, then back to Uruk for a second time, then to Ur again, then to Adab, then to Mari, then back to Kish yet again for a third dynasty. The list continues in this fashion, power ping-ponging across the Mesopotamian plain from city to city. This narrative is elegant and satisfying in its simplicity, but archaeology and textual evidence from other sources make clear it's not historically accurate. Many of these dynasties ruled simultaneously, not sequentially. The king list's insistence on singular sovereignty reflects political theology rather than historical reality. It's arguing that legitimate power is by its nature unified, that true kingship cannot be divided or shared. This ideology served the purposes of later rulers who wanted to claim exclusive authority over all of Mesopotamia by presenting themselves as heirs to an unbroken chain of singular sovereignty stretching back to the beginning of time. But even if the king list's chronology is propaganda rather than history, it preserves valuable information about these early dynasties. The names of kings, the names of cities, details about building projects and military campaigns, all of this can be cross-referenced with archaeological evidence and other textual sources to construct a more accurate picture of the early dynastic period. What emerges is a landscape of competing city-states, each controlling a small region of irrigated farmland surrounding an urban centre. These cities were constantly at war with each other, fighting over water rights, agricultural land, trade routes, and prestige. A successful ruler might conquer several neighbouring cities and rule over a small empire for a generation or two, but these conquests rarely lasted. When the conquering king died, the subjugated cities usually revolted, and the empire fragmented back into independent city-states. Kingship during this period was not hereditary in the absolute sense we often imagine. Yes, sons frequently succeeded their fathers, but kingship had to be earned and maintained through success. A weak or incompetent heir could be passed over for a brother, cousin, or even an unrelated military commander. The concept of divine kingship meant that the gods chose who would rule, and the gods' choice was demonstrated through victory in battle, success in building projects, and the prosperity of the land. A king who failed in these areas had clearly lost divine favour, which justified removing him. Kings of this era had several primary responsibilities. First and foremost, they were military commanders. They led armies in person, fought in the front ranks of battle, and were expected to demonstrate personal courage and martial prowess. The king was the champion of his city, and his reputation was built on successful conquests and defence against enemies. Second, kings were judges and lawgivers. They were expected to maintain justice, settle disputes, protect the weak from the strong, and ensure that the social order functioned properly. Many royal inscriptions emphasize a king's role in establishing justice and upholding the rights of widows and orphans, who had no other protection in that patriarchal society. Third, kings were builders. They constructed and maintained temples, city walls, irrigation canals, granaries, and other infrastructure. These building projects were not merely practical, they were also religious and political statements. A temple construction pleased the gods and demonstrated the king's piety and prosperity. City walls protected the people and showed the king's strength. Canals improved agriculture and proved the king's care for his subjects' welfare. Fourth, kings served as high priests in the temples of their patron deities. They performed sacrifices, oversaw festivals, and maintained the proper relationship between their city and its gods. In Sumerian theology, cities were understood as belonging to specific deities. Uruk belonged to Inanna, goddess of love and war. Ur belonged to Nanna, the moon god. Eridu belonged to Enki, god of wisdom and fresh water. The human king ruled as the god's representative, managing the divine property on behalf of its true owner. The relationship between kings and gods was complex and reciprocal. Gods provided victories, prosperity, and legitimacy. In return, kings provided offerings, maintained temples, and upheld the divine order on earth. This wasn't simply a matter of religious belief. It was fundamental to how government functioned. Temple complexes were the largest economic institutions in Sumerian cities, controlling vast amounts of land and employing thousands of workers. The king, as the god's representative, managed these resources, using temple wealth to finance armies, building projects, and administration. Royal inscriptions from the early dynastic period show kings carefully documenting their achievements for the god's benefit. They describe their victories in battle, list the temples they constructed or renovated, enumerate the offerings they made, detail the canals they dug and the walls they built. These inscriptions weren't meant primarily for human audiences. They were dedicated to the gods, permanent records proving that the king had fulfilled his duties. They were also meant for future kings, establishing a standard of royal conduct and achievement against which successors would be measured. One inscription that survived from this period comes from Enma-Baraghese of Kish, whose name we mentioned earlier in connection with Gilgamesh. Enma-Baraghese is the first king from the Sumerian king list, who can be confirmed through independent archaeological evidence. His inscriptions indicate he campaigned against Elam, a region to the east of Sumer, and brought back tribute. This confirms that at least by his reign, Sumerian military power extended beyond the immediate region of the southern Mesopotamian plain. Another significant early ruler was Messana-Parda, founder of the first dynasty of Ea. His tomb was discovered by archaeologist Leonard Woolley in the 1920s, along with the famous royal cemetery of Ea containing dozens of burials from this period. These tombs reveal the extraordinary wealth of early dynastic rulers and the elaborate death rituals they practiced. Some tombs contained not just the deceased ruler but dozens of attendants, apparently sacrificed to accompany their master into the afterlife, all wearing their finest jewellery and positioned as if participating in some final ceremony. These burials show us just how much power these early kings wielded, power sufficient to command not just the living, but the dead as well. The royal cemetery of Ur also provided our first clear evidence of sophisticated metalworking, intricate jewellery design, and advanced artistic techniques in early dynastic Sumer. Gold and lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, carnelian from India, all flowed into Ur and were crafted into objects of stunning beauty. The wealth displayed in these tombs demonstrates that Sumerian trade networks extended thousands of miles in multiple directions, bringing together resources from across the known world. As we move forward through the early dynastic period, the historical record becomes clearer and more detailed. More kings can be confirmed through contemporary inscriptions. The reign lengths recorded in the king list become more plausible, gradually approaching realistic human lifespans. We're approaching the transition point where myth fully gives way to history, where the legendary kings of early Sumer are succeeded by rulers we can document and verify, whose lives and reigns can be reconstructed with reasonable confidence. Sargon of Akkad, the birth of empire. Around 2300 BCE, something unprecedented happened in Mesopotamian history. For the first time, instead of power moving from one city-state to another in an endless cycle of rise and fall, a single ruler conquered and held virtually all of Mesopotamia, creating what many historians consider the world's first true empire. His name was Sargon, and he would become one of the most legendary figures in ancient Near Eastern history, a model of kingship that would influence rulers for thousands of years to come. Sargon's origins, according to the legend he himself appears to have promoted, or at least allowed to circulate, were remarkably humble. He claimed to have been born in secret to a mother who was a priestess, perhaps one of the sacred temple prostitutes who served the goddess Ishtar. His father was unknown. Unable or unwilling to keep her child, his mother placed the infant in a reed basket sealed with bitumen and set him adrift on the Euphrates River. The basket was found by Aki, a water drawer or gardener, who adopted the boy and raised him as his own son. As a young man, Sargon served as a gardener, then rose to become cupbearer to Ur-Zababa, king of Kish. This birth narrative is suspiciously similar to other ancient hero stories, most famously that of Moses in the Hebrew Bible, which was composed many centuries after Sargon's time and may have been influenced by his legend. The formulaic nature of the story leads most scholars to doubt its historical accuracy, viewing it instead as a carefully crafted origin myth designed to serve specific political purposes. By presenting himself as an orphan who rose from nothing, Sargon distinguished himself from the traditional royal dynasties that claimed legitimacy through bloodline. He couldn't point to divine ancestry or noble birth. Instead, he presented himself as a man chosen by the gods not for who he was born, but for what he could accomplish. According to one ancient account, though scholars debate whether this reflects actual events or later legendary elaboration, Ur-Zababa, feeling threatened by Sargon's growing power and popularity, sent him to Lugal-Zaggisi of Uruk carrying a message that requested Sargon's execution. What happened next varies in different versions of the story, but the end result is clear from historical records. Sargon overthrew Kish, defeated Lugal-Zaggisi in battle, and claimed power for himself. Lugal-Zaggisi, who had previously conquered most of the Sumerian city-states and proclaimed himself king of the land, ended up as Sargon's prisoner. Contemporary inscriptions confirm he was displayed in a neck stock at the gates of the Temple of Enlil in Nippur, the religious center of Sumer, in what must have been a calculated humiliation designed to demonstrate that Sargon now held the power that Lugal-Zaggisi had once wielded. From this position of strength, Sargon launched campaigns of conquest that would eventually bring all of Mesopotamia under his control. He defeated the major Sumerian cities one by one: Ur, Lagash, Umma, Nippur, Larsa. He campaigned east into Elam, north to Mari and Asher, and west all the way to the Mediterranean coast. Some later texts claim his armies reached as far as Cyprus, though this is difficult to verify and may represent exaggeration by later scribes. What is clear from contemporary and near-contemporary evidence is that Sargon's military reach exceeded anything Mesopotamia had seen before. He didn't just conquer neighboring city-states. He built an empire that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, encompassing much of the Fertile Crescent. But Sargon understood that conquest was only the beginning. Holding an empire required more than military force. It required administration, communication, and a system that could maintain control even when the king and his armies were elsewhere. Sargon developed what may have been history's first imperial bureaucracy. He placed Akkadian governors in conquered cities, men loyal to him personally rather than to local interests. These governors oversaw tax collection, maintained order, and commanded small garrisons of troops. They reported directly to Sargon, who could thus monitor events across his entire empire. To facilitate communication across this vast territory, Sargon established a postal system, complete with clay envelope seals to ensure privacy and authenticity of messages. This innovation allowed the imperial government to function effectively across hundreds of miles, coordinating military campaigns, responding to crises, and keeping the central authority informed about local conditions. Royal messengers travelling on official business were given the right to commandeer horses, boats, and supplies as needed, ensuring rapid communication between the capital and distant provinces. Sargon made Akkadian, his native Semitic language, the official language of administration throughout the empire. Previously, Sumerian had been the language of government and high culture in Mesopotamia. Sargon didn't suppress Sumerian, it remained the language of religious texts and scholarly learning. But by making Akkadian the language of law and bureaucracy, he helped unify his diverse empire and ensured that his officials, recruited from across Mesopotamia, could communicate effectively with each other. He founded a new capital city, Akkad, whose location remains unknown to this day despite extensive archaeological searches. Akkad became the center of his empire, home to his palace, his government, and his army. The city gave its name to both Sargon's empire and to the Akkadian language and culture that he promoted. For over a century, Akkad was the most important city in Mesopotamia, surpassing even ancient centers like Ur and Uruk in power and prestige. Sargon's military innovations were as important as his administrative reforms. Later sources credit him with maintaining a professional standing army of 5,400 men, though this specific number comes from texts written long after his reign and may be more symbolic than literal. What seems clear is that he maintained some form of permanent military force, paid from the imperial treasury, rather than relying solely on temporary levies of farmers and craftsmen called up for specific campaigns. If accurate, this would represent one of the first instances of a professional standing army in history, giving him a decisive advantage over rival city-states that depended on militias. His army pioneered new weapons and tactics, bronze-tipped spears and arrows, copper helmets and shields, organized phalanx formations, massed archery. All of these innovations gave Sargon's forces superior combat power. He also brought back the composite bow, a weapon that had been largely abandoned but which, in the hands of trained archers, could strike down enemies at distances that made traditional hand-to-hand combat unnecessary. His armies were well supplied through captured resources and imperial taxation, allowing them to campaign far from home for extended periods. Trade flourished under Sargon's empire. With most of Mesopotamia under unified control, merchants could travel safely across vast distances without paying tolls at every city-state border. Commercial connections expanded to the Indus Valley in the east, bringing Indian pearls and ivory to Mesopotamia. Trade routes reached Cyprus and possibly Crete. Cedarwood from Lebanon, copper from Anatolia, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, all flowed into Akkad in exchange for Mesopotamian grain, wool, and manufactured goods. This trade enriched Sargon's empire and demonstrated that imperial peace could bring prosperity as well as military glory. Sargon understood the importance of symbolism and propaganda. He commissioned numerous victory steles, stone monuments depicting his military triumphs and recording his achievements. These were placed in temples and public spaces across his empire, constant reminders of who held power. Royal scribes composed hymns praising Sargon's wisdom, justice, and divine favor. He presented himself as the chosen servant of the gods, particularly of Ishtar, goddess of love and war, who he claimed had loved him since his youth and guided him to greatness. One particularly bold propaganda move was installing his daughter Enheduanna as high priestess of the moon god Nanna at Ur. Enheduanna was a remarkable figure in her own right. She is the first author in human history whose name we know, the first person to sign their own written compositions. She wrote hymns and ritual poetry, including the famous exaltation of Inanna praising the goddess Ishtar and linking Ishtar's power to her father's political authority. Enheduanna served as priestess for 40 years, successfully bridging Sumerian religious tradition and Akkadian imperial power, helping to legitimize her father's rule in the eyes of the conquered Sumerian cities. Sargon's reign lasted 56 years, an extraordinary length even by modern standards, and even more remarkable given the violent politics of the ancient Near East. He died of natural causes, having seen his empire expand, consolidate, and flourish. He had transformed himself from a cupbearer of uncertain parentage to the most powerful ruler the world had yet seen, master of an empire that stretched from horizon to horizon. His legacy extended far beyond his lifetime. Later Mesopotamian kings saw Sargon as the ideal empire builder. The Sumerian king list records his reign in detail. The Assyrians, who rose to power over 1,000 years after Sargon's death, claimed direct descent from him and saw themselves as restoring his empire. The Neo-Babylonians studied his reign and tried to emulate his achievements. Stories about Sargon circulated for millennia, becoming more legendary with each retelling, until the historical man became as mythical as Gilgamesh, a figure who represented the possibility that a nobody could become somebody through courage, ambition, and divine favor. But during his lifetime, Sargon was very human. He faced rebellions and had to crush them repeatedly. His inscriptions mention 9 major revolts during his reign, requiring him to personally lead his armies to restore order. He dealt with conspiracies and assassination attempts. He made mistakes in diplomacy and policy that created enemies. He was not superhuman, despite what his propaganda claimed. He was simply extremely good at his job, a man of genuine military genius and administrative ability who understood that power required both strength and flexibility, both fear and loyalty, both the sword and the olive branch. And he understood something else, something that made him different from the city-state kings who came before him. He understood that the world had grown too complex, too interconnected, for small, independent cities to thrive. The future belonged to larger political units, to empires that could coordinate resources across vast territories, that could protect trade routes, that could impose peace on regions that had known nothing but constant warfare between rivals. Sargon didn't just conquer, he created something new, a template for how diverse peoples could be governed under a single authority. His empire would eventually fall, but the idea of empire, which he pioneered, would endure and shape the history of the ancient Near East for thousands of years to come. The Akkadian dynasty and cultural legacy, Sargon's death around 2279 BCE, did not mark the end of Akkadian power. His sons Rimush and Manishtushu succeeded him, ruling in succession and struggling to hold together the empire their father had built. Both died violently, possibly assassinated, suggesting the empire was far from stable even at its height. But the dynasty survived these turbulent transitions and reached its greatest extent and most confident expression under Sargon's grandson, Naram-Sin, who ruled for 37 years and transformed the Akkadian Empire from a military conquest into a lasting cultural and political force. Naram-Sin took the unprecedented step of declaring himself a living god. Previous kings had claimed divine favor, presented themselves as chosen by the gods to rule. But Naram-Sin went further. He added the divine determinative before his name in inscriptions, a cuneiform marker that indicated divinity, something previously reserved only for gods. He called himself God of Akkad and claimed to be the husband of the goddess Ishtar. He took the title King of the Four Quarters, meaning ruler of the entire known world. His self-deification was controversial even in his own time, but it expressed a confidence in royal power that earlier rulers had not quite dared to claim. Under Naram-Sin, the empire expanded even further. He campaigned into the mountains of Armenia in the north, into Elam in the east, and west toward Anatolia. He crushed a major revolt known as the Great Rebellion, in which numerous cities across the empire rose up simultaneously to throw off Akkadian rule. According to later texts, 17 kings allied against him, but Naram-Sin defeated them all in a series of battles that secured his reputation as a military genius equal to or surpassing his grandfather Sargon. The famous Victory Stele of Naram-Sin, discovered in Susa but probably taken there as loot centuries after its creation, depicts the king as larger than life, striding up a mountain while his enemies fall before him. He wears the horned helmet that symbolized divinity in Mesopotamian iconography, and stars representing the gods shine above him, blessing his victory. The stele's artistic composition is remarkably sophisticated, with Naram-Sin dominating the scene, his figure breaking out of the frame's boundaries to emphasize his transcendent power. It's propaganda, of course, but propaganda executed with genuine artistic brilliance. The Akkadian Empire at its height represented a new form of political organization in world history. It was not simply a larger version of the old Sumerian city-states. It was qualitatively different, with centralized administration, unified law, standardized weights and measures, and a professional bureaucracy that could function across vast distances. The empire collected taxes from all subject territories and used that revenue to maintain armies, build infrastructure, fund monumental architecture, and support a court of officials, scribes, artists, and craftsmen. The Akkadian language, which had previously been spoken but rarely written, became during this period a language of literature and scholarship. Scribes adapted the cuneiform writing system, originally developed for Sumerian, to represent Akkadians' different grammar and phonetics. This linguistic development had profound long-term consequences. Akkadian would remain the diplomatic language of the Near East for over 1,000 years, used from Egypt to Anatolia to Persia as the common tongue of international relations. Even after the fall of the Akkadian Empire, even after Akkadian ceased to be anyone's native language, it continued to be studied, written, and used by educated elites throughout the ancient Near East. The empire supported a flourishing artistic culture. Akkadian sculpture, particularly seal carving, reached levels of naturalism and technical sophistication unprecedented in Mesopotamian art. Cylinder seals from this period depict complex mythological scenes, religious rituals, and royal activities with stunning detail and grace. The human figure in Akkadian art became more realistic, showing individual characteristics rather than the stylized forms of earlier Sumerian work. Artistic standards established during the Akkadian period influenced Mesopotamian art for centuries afterward. Literature also flourished. Although most Akkadian literary texts that have survived come from later copies, many were first composed during the empire. The legend of Sargon, describing the founder's miraculous birth and rise to power, was probably written during this period. Epic poetry celebrating royal achievements, hymns to gods, love poetry, wisdom literature, all were produced by scribes working for the imperial court or in temple schools across the empire. The Akkadian literary tradition that began during this period would eventually produce the Epic of Gilgamesh in its fullest form, synthesizing earlier Sumerian stories into a unified narrative masterpiece. Yet despite its achievements, the Akkadian Empire contained the seeds of its own destruction. The very diversity that made it impressive also made it difficult to govern. Sumerian cities resented Akkadian rule, seeing the Semitic-speaking conquerors as foreigners who had destroyed the old order. Rebellions were constant and required brutal suppression, which only increased resentment. The empire's extended trade networks were vulnerable to disruption. Military campaigns on multiple frontiers strained resources. The central government's effectiveness depended heavily on the personal ability of individual kings, and when weaker rulers inherited the throne, problems multiplied. After Naram-Sin's death, his son Shar-Kali-Shari ruled for 25 years, but faced increasingly severe challenges. A mysterious people called the Gutians, mountain dwellers from the Zagros range to the east, began raiding Mesopotamian cities. Simultaneously, other groups pressed in from different directions. The empire began to fragment as governors in outlying regions stopped obeying orders from Akkad and effectively became independent rulers. Trade disrupted. tax revenue fell. The army, no longer regularly paid, lost discipline and effectiveness. Some scholars have suggested that climate change played a role in the empire's collapse. Evidence from lake sediments and other geological sources indicates a major drought struck the Near East around 2100 BCE, at exactly the time the Akkadian Empire fell. This drought, part of what's called the 4.2 kiloyear event, may have caused widespread crop failures, famine, and population movement as people fled dying agricultural regions. An empire already under stress from rebellion and invasion would have been exceptionally vulnerable to such an environmental catastrophe. Whatever the exact causes, by around 2100 BCE, the Akkadian Empire had collapsed. Gutian warlords controlled much of northern Mesopotamia. Independent dynasties arose in various cities. Akkad itself may have been destroyed or simply abandoned. We don't know because we've never found it. The first successful attempt at creating a unified Mesopotamian state had lasted less than 2 centuries, but the Akkadian Empire's influence far outlasted its political existence. Later kings across Mesopotamia claimed Akkadian ancestry, or presented themselves as restoring Akkadian glory. The Akkadian language continued to spread and develop, eventually splitting into dialects that would become Babylonian and Assyrian. Administrative practices pioneered by Sargon and his successors became standard across the Near East. The concept of empire itself, of unified rule over diverse peoples and territories, had been proven possible even if difficult. Every later empire builder in Mesopotamian history, from the 3rd dynasty of Ur to the Neo-Assyrian Empire to the Babylonians, owed an intellectual debt to Sargon's example. The Akkadian Empire demonstrated that Mesopotamia could be unified under a single government, that Sumerian and Semitic peoples could live together under common law, that effective administration could coordinate activities across vast distances, that military power and cultural achievement could reinforce each other to create something greater than the sum of its parts. The empire fell, but the precedent remained. The idea of a united Mesopotamia under a powerful king who claimed divine support and ruled through a professional bureaucracy and standing army, this became the template against which all future Mesopotamian rulers would measure themselves, Urnamu and the Sumerian Renaissance. After the chaos following the Akkadian collapse, Mesopotamia remained fragmented for several generations. Gutian warlords, whom the Sumerians despised as barbarians ignorant of proper worship and care for the land, held nominal control over parts of the region, but exercised little effective government. Contemporary Sumerian texts from this period lament the disorder, describing it as a time when grass grew high on the highways and proper religious observances were neglected. Around 2120 BCE, according to the middle chronology most scholars use, a ruler named Utu-Hagel, king of Uruk, finally took action. He raised an army, marched against the Gutian king Tirigan, defeated him in battle, and drove the remaining Gutian forces out of Sumer. For a brief time, it appeared that Uruk would reassert itself as the dominant power in Mesopotamia, continuing its ancient tradition as one of Sumer's greatest cities. But Utu-Hagel's triumph was short-lived. After ruling for only 7 years, he was overthrown in a palace coup led by Urnamu, who served as military governor of Ur. The exact relationship between Utu-Hagel and Urnamu remains debated by scholars. Some sources suggest they may have been brothers, while others interpret the evidence differently. What is certain is that Urnamu seized power and founded what historians call the 3rd dynasty of Ur. Urnamu founded what historians call the 3rd dynasty of Ur, beginning what's often called the Neo-Sumerian period or the Sumerian Renaissance. For the next century, Ur would be the center of the last great flowering of Sumerian civilization, a golden age that deliberately looked back to earlier traditions while incorporating administrative and political innovations learned from the Akkadians. It was both a restoration and a new creation, an attempt to recapture ancient glory while building something adapted to current realities. Urnamu faced significant challenges at the start of his reign. Mesopotamia had been divided and disordered for generations. Irrigation systems needed massive repairs, city walls had crumbled, temples stood in disrepair, bandits controlled the highways, local strongmen ruled small territories as de facto independent warlords. To reunify Sumer and re-establish effective government required both military force and administrative brilliance. Urnamu possessed both. Militarily, he campaigned methodically across southern Mesopotamia, defeating rival powers and bringing city after city under his control. He defeated Lagash, conquered territories previously held by Elamites in the east, and established Ur's dominance over most of the old Sumerian heartland. Unlike the Akkadians, who had tried to impose their Semitic language and culture on Sumer, Urnamu presented himself as a restorer of traditional Sumerian values. He wrote his inscriptions in Sumerian rather than Akkadian. He emphasized his role in maintaining ancient temples and observing proper religious rituals. He called himself King of Ur and King of Sumer and Akkad, positioning himself as heir to both Sumerian and Akkadian traditions. But Urnamu's greatest legacy was not military conquest. It was his legal code, known today as the Code of Urnamu, the oldest surviving law code in human history. Scholars generally date this code to around 2100 to 2050 BCE, making it predate the famous Code of Hammurabi by nearly 300 years. The code as we have it consists of 37 laws based on the most complete tablet discovered at Nippur, though some sections remain damaged or lost, so the original may have contained additional provisions. The code begins with a prologue that presents Urnamu as chosen by the gods An and Enlil to establish justice throughout the land. It describes how the king expelled evil and violence, how he established honest weights and measures so merchants could not cheat customers, how he protected widows and orphans from oppression by the powerful. Whether these reforms were fully implemented as described or represent idealized royal propaganda, they reflect genuine Sumerian concerns with social justice that kings were expected to address. The laws themselves cover issues like homicide, bodily injury, marriage and divorce, accusations of witchcraft, runaway slaves and property disputes. Unlike later codes such as Hammurabi's, which often prescribed the death penalty or mutilation for crimes, the Code of Urnamu primarily relies on monetary compensation as punishment. If a man kills another man's wife, he pays a fine. If he severs another man's foot, he pays a specific amount. The code attempted to establish a systematic, predictable framework for justice, replacing arbitrary judgment with established precedent. This approach to law was revolutionary. By writing down legal principles and punishments and making them public, Urnamu created a system where people could know in advance what was legal and what was forbidden, what penalties they faced for various actions. Justice became less dependent on a judge's whim or a powerful person's favor and more based on established rules that applied to everyone. The code wasn't perfectly egalitarian. Different penalties applied to free persons versus slaves, for example, but it represented a huge step toward the rule of law rather than the rule of men. Urnamu was also a prolific builder. He initiated construction of ziggurats, the massive stepped pyramid temples that became iconic symbols of Mesopotamian architecture in cities across his realm. The most famous is the Great Ziggurat of Ur, which still stands, partially reconstructed in modern Iraq. This structure originally rose 70 feet high, built in 3 massive terraces, with a shrine to the moon god Nana at its summit. The ziggurat served both religious and symbolic purposes. It was a temple, a place where priests could ascend to meet the god. But it was also a statement of royal power and piety, a monument visible for miles across the flat Mesopotamian plain, proclaiming Ur's greatness and Urnamu's devotion to the gods. Beyond the ziggurat, Urnamu undertook extensive building projects throughout his kingdom. He dug canals to improve irrigation and restore farmland that had fallen out of cultivation during the Gutian period. He built or rebuilt city walls, strengthening defenses He constructed roads to facilitate travel and trade. He renovated temples in multiple cities, ensuring that the gods were properly housed and worshipped. These projects required enormous resources and labour, but they served practical purposes while also demonstrating the king's effectiveness and divine favour. The administration Ur-Nammu established was remarkably sophisticated. He created a bureaucracy that documented everything in meticulous detail. Thousands upon thousands of clay tablets have survived from the Ur-3 period, recording grain disbursements, work assignments, trade transactions, temple offerings, criminal cases, land surveys, and countless other aspects of government and economic activity. This bureaucratic system allowed the central government to coordinate activities across a large territory, monitor local officials, collect taxes efficiently, and respond to problems quickly. The Ur-3 state operated what might be called a planned economy. Large temple and royal estates employed thousands of workers who received rations rather than wages. The government allocated specific quantities of grain, wool, and other supplies to workshops, military units, and building projects. Workers were organized into teams, their productivity monitored, their output recorded. It was an early experiment in centralized economic planning, successful in its ability to mobilize resources for major projects, but also rigid and potentially oppressive in how it controlled workers' lives. Ur-Nammu died in battle around 2094 BCE, killed while fighting the Gutians according to traditional accounts. The circumstances of his death appear somewhat inglorious in the sources. A Sumerian literary composition called The Death of Ur-Nammu describes how his army abandoned him on the battlefield and his body lay unburied, like a broken pot. Whether this reflects actual events or represents later political narratives meant to contrast his death with his son's eventual victory remains unclear. Some scholars suggest the unflattering description might have served political purposes for those who came after, possibly reflecting court factions or attempts to legitimize his successor. What we can say with more certainty is that despite however his reign ended, Ur-Nammu's achievements during his approximately 18 years of rule proved lasting. What we do know is that despite the manner of his death, Ur-Nammu's legacy endured. His son Shulgi inherited a strong, well-organized state and would rule for almost 50 years, bringing the third dynasty of Ur to its peak. The legal principles Ur-Nammu established influenced lawmaking throughout Mesopotamian history. His architectural projects, especially these ziggurats, set standards that later builders tried to match. His administrative systems became templates for how to govern a large territorial state. And his self-presentation as a pious king devoted to justice became the ideal against which later rulers measured themselves. Ur-Nammu showed that after the imperial experiment of Akkad, after the chaos of Gutian rule, effective government could be restored by combining military strength with administrative competence, by honoring traditional values while embracing innovation, by building monuments that inspired awe while establishing systems that provided practical benefits. He created a state that would last a century, the last time native Sumerian culture would dominate Mesopotamia before Semitic languages and peoples became permanently ascendant. He was, in his own way, as significant as Sargon, not for creating something entirely new, but for proving that what had been broken could be repaired, that civilization could be restored even after collapse. The third dynasty of Ur and administrative mastery, Ur-Nammu's son Shulgi, inherited the throne around 2094 BCE and would reign for 48 years, one of the longest and most successful reigns in Mesopotamian history. Under Shulgi, the third dynasty of Ur reached its political and cultural zenith, developing an administrative system so sophisticated that it would influence how governments operated throughout the Near East for centuries to come. The sheer volume of written records surviving from Shulgi's reign is staggering, giving us an extraordinarily detailed picture of how a Bronze Age state actually functioned. Shulgi was a different kind of ruler than his father. Ur-Nammu had been primarily a warrior and builder, a man who established power through conquest and demonstrated it through monumental architecture. Shulgi, based on the extensive propaganda produced during his reign, presented himself more as an intellectual and patron of arts and letters, a king who saw administration as an art form in itself. His inscriptions claim he was literate in both Sumerian and Akkadian, that he studied mathematics and music, that he understood the scribal arts. Whether these claims reflect literal truth or represent idealized royal propaganda, they reveal what Shulgi wanted people to believe about him, that he was not just a strong king but a wise one, not just a warrior but a scholar. Shulgi's inscriptions and the numerous hymns composed in his honor describe an active, energetic ruler who personally inspected his kingdom regularly. One particularly famous text describes how he once ran from Nipper to Ur and back in a single day, a distance of over 100 miles, supposedly to demonstrate his physical prowess and divine favor. Most scholars view this account as legendary rather than literal, an expression of royal ideology rather than an athletic achievement. Such stories emphasize the king's superhuman qualities and his intimate connection with his realm. The administrative system Shulgi perfected represented a remarkable achievement in pre-modern governance. At its heart was an extensive bureaucracy of scribes who documented virtually every aspect of economic activity. Temple and state workshops that produced textiles recorded how much wool was issued to each worker and how much finished cloth each produced. Agricultural estates documented planting, irrigation, harvesting, and storage of crops. Military units reported their strength, equipment, and rations. Building projects noted materials used and labor deployed. Trade missions recorded goods sent out and tribute received. All of this was written on clay tablets, filed in archives, and periodically reviewed by higher-level officials. This system allowed for unprecedented control and coordination. The government knew exactly what resources were available and where they were located. It could plan projects years in advance, assembling the necessary materials and workforce. It could detect fraud and inefficiency by comparing expected outputs to actual production. It could respond to local shortages by shipping supplies from other regions. It was, in essence, an early version of central planning, and while it had limitations and rigidities that would eventually contribute to the dynasty's collapse, it worked remarkably well for several generations. Shulgi also standardized weights, measures, and even calendar systems across his realm. This standardization facilitated trade and taxation, making it easier for merchants to conduct business across different cities and for the government to collect consistent revenue. He reformed the calendar, establishing a unified system that all provinces used, which helped coordinate activities that required precise timing, such as religious festivals or military campaigns. The military under Shulgi was organized as a professional force, paid through the state's centralized distribution system. Soldiers received regular rations of grain, oil, and wool. Officers were granted land holdings that provided additional income. The army was divided into specialized units: infantry with spears and shields, archers, chariot crews, engineers for siege warfare. Garrisons were stationed at strategic points throughout the kingdom and along its borders. This military establishment allowed Shulgi to campaign regularly to maintain and expand his territory. Shulgi conducted numerous military campaigns during his long reign. He fought against the Gutians in the mountains to the east, finally crushing them as a political force and avenging his father's death. He campaigned in Elam, bringing much of that region under Ur's control. He extended his authority north into territories that had been part of the Akkadian Empire, but had since become independent. By the end of his reign, Shulgi controlled a territory roughly comparable to Naram-Sin's empire at its height, stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Taurus Mountains. One of Shulgi's most significant innovations was his self-deification. Following Naram-Sin's example but taking it further, Shulgi declared himself a god during his lifetime. He used the divine determinative before his name in inscriptions. Temples were dedicated to him. Priests offered sacrifices to him. People prayed to him as they would to any other deity. This deification served multiple purposes. It elevated the king above ordinary mortals, making rebellion against him not just treason, but sacrilege. It provided theological justification for the state's extensive power over people's lives, and it aligned Shulgi with the gods in people's minds, making him seem part of the eternal order rather than a temporary human authority. The religious implications of royal deification were profound. Traditional Sumerian theology held that gods owned the cities and kings ruled as their representatives. By declaring himself a god, Shulgi claimed direct divine authority rather than delegated power. He became not the servant of the gods, but one of them, deserving worship in his own right. This was controversial then, and remains controversial in scholarly interpretation today. Some see it as hubristic overreach that ultimately contributed to the dynasty's fall. Others see it as a logical development in the increasing centralization and personalization of royal power. Cultural production flourished under Shulgi's patronage. Scribal schools expanded, training new generations in the complex art of cuneiform writing. Literary texts were composed, copied, and preserved in temple and palace libraries. The most complete versions of earlier Sumerian poetry that we possess today often come from manuscripts written during the Ur III. Third period. New works were created as well, including the extensive body of royal hymns praising Shulgi's wisdom, strength, piety, and accomplishments. These hymns, while propagandistic, also represent genuine literary artistry, with sophisticated wordplay, complex metaphors, and emotional depth. Legal development continued under Shulgi. While his father Ur-Nammu had created the first law code, Shulgi's reign saw the elaboration and systematization of legal principles. Court decisions were recorded and compiled, creating a body of case law that supplemented the formal code. Legal education became more formalized, with specialized scribes trained in law serving as judges and legal advisors. The concept that law should be written, public, and applied consistently rather than depending on individual judgments became firmly established during this period. Trade expanded dramatically under Ur III. The state monopolized long-distance trade in luxury goods, with royal merchants traveling to foreign lands carrying government goods and returning with exotic imports. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, timber from Lebanon, copper from Anatolia, gold and silver from various sources, all flowed into Ur through these state-controlled trade networks. The wealth this generated funded Shulgi's building projects, military campaigns, and lavish court. But it also made the state vulnerable to trade disruptions, as would become evident later. Shulgi's successors, his sons Amarsin and Shusin, continued his policies with reasonable success. They maintained the administrative system, conducted military campaigns to defend the borders, and supported religious and cultural institutions. But cracks were beginning to show in the dynasty's foundation. The highly centralized system depended on the personal ability and energy of the ruler. When weaker kings inherited the throne, the machinery of government didn't work as smoothly. Local officials gained more autonomy, sometimes effectively becoming independent rulers in their regions while nominally owing allegiance to Ea. Environmental factors may have contributed to the dynasty's problems, though the evidence for this remains debated among scholars. Some research suggests that soil salinization, the gradual accumulation of salt in irrigated soil after millennia of farming, may have been reducing agricultural productivity in southern Mesopotamia during this period. If accurate, this would have forced farmers to abandon fields that had become too salty to produce crops, reducing the land available for cultivation, and thus the tax base supporting the state. Climate studies have also identified potential changes in precipitation patterns that might have affected river levels and irrigation capacity, though connecting specific political collapses to climate events requires caution. Most critically, the dynasty faced increasing pressure from outside groups. The Amorites, Semitic-speaking pastoral nomads from the Syrian desert, began migrating into Mesopotamia in large numbers, sometimes peacefully infiltrating, sometimes raiding settled territories. The centralized state struggled to control its borders against these mobile groups who could strike quickly and disappear before the army could respond. The Elamites to the east, having been subjugated by Shulgi, waited for opportunities to throw off Ur's control and reassert their independence. The last king of the dynasty, Ibisin, ruled for 24 years but lost control over most of his kingdom during that time. Governors of major cities, seeing the central government weakening, declared independence. Trade disrupted as routes became unsafe. Tax revenue fell as provinces stopped sending tribute. Food shortages developed as the agricultural system broke down. Ibisin issued desperate pleas for help in letters that have survived, begging his nominal vassals to send grain to feed the capital's population, but receiving either excuses or silence in return. Around 2004 BCE, according to the traditional chronology, an Elamite army marched on besieged the city, and eventually broke through its defences. The exact sequence of events remains unclear from the fragmentary records that survive, but the outcome is certain. The city was sacked, the great temple of Nana was destroyed or heavily damaged, and Ibisin was carried off to Elam in chains, where he presumably died in captivity. The third dynasty of Ur came to an abrupt and violent end. A Sumerian poem called The Lament for Ur describes the destruction in agonizing detail, portraying a city consumed by fire, its people slaughtered or enslaved, its gods departing in sorrow, abandoning the city that had served them so faithfully. The fall of Ur was a watershed moment in Mesopotamian history. Never again would a native Sumerian dynasty rule over Mesopotamia. The Amorites would establish new kingdoms, including eventually the dynasty of Hammurabi in Babylon. The Sumerian language, which had been declining as a spoken language even during the Surtha III period, would cease to be spoken entirely, surviving only as a scholarly and religious language studied by educated scribes. Sumerian culture didn't disappear, it was absorbed and transformed by the peoples who succeeded the Sumerians. But the era of Sumerian political dominance was over, ended by that Elamite conquest. Yet the third dynasty of Ur left an immense legacy. Its administrative systems influenced how governments operated throughout the ancient Near East for centuries. Its legal traditions contributed to later law codes. Its literature, preserved on clay tablets, became part of the canonical texts studied in scribal schools across Mesopotamia. Its architectural achievements, particularly the ziggurats, became models that later builders tried to emulate, and its vision of kingship, the divine king who rules through law and bureaucracy as much as through military might, who supports culture and learning, who maintains order and justice across a large territory, this became an ideal that would influence Mesopotamian rulers all the way down to the Persian conquest 2 millennia later. Hammurabi of Babylon and the legal tradition. After the fall of the third dynasty of Ur, Mesopotamia entered another period of political fragmentation known as the Isin-Larsa period, named for two rival dynasties that competed for control of the south, while various Amorite kingdoms struggled for dominance in the north. This era of division lasted nearly 2 centuries, until a relatively minor king from a relatively minor city changed everything through military prowess, political cunning, and one of history's most famous law codes. His name was Hammurabi, and though he ruled from Babylon rather than a traditional Sumerian city, his achievements built directly on the legal and administrative traditions that Sumerian kings had developed over 2,000 years. Hammurabi was the 6th king of Babylon's first dynasty, an Amorite lineage that had established itself in Babylon around 1950 BCE. When Hammurabi inherited the throne around 1792 BCE, using the middle chronology that most scholars employ for this period, Babylon controlled only a small territory surrounding the city. The region's dominant power was Rim-Sin of Larsa, an old king who had ruled for decades and controlled most of southern Mesopotamia. Hammurabi spent the first 29 years of his reign carefully building his strength, maintaining peace with Rimsin and other powerful neighbors, developing his administration, and waiting for opportunities. His patience paid off. When Rimsin finally grew old and weak, Hammurabi struck. In a swift campaign, he conquered Larsa and absorbed its entire territory into his own kingdom. But he didn't stop there. Over the next few years, Hammurabi conquered Eshnunna, Mari, and Assyria. Through combinations of military force, diplomacy, and betrayal, he made alliances to isolate enemies, then broke those alliances when convenient. He supported rebels in rival kingdoms, then absorbed the resulting chaos. He was, by all evidence, completely ruthless in his pursuit of power. By the time Hammurabi died around 1750 BCE, he had created a kingdom that controlled virtually all of Mesopotamia, from the Persian Gulf to the mountains of eastern Anatolia. He had accomplished what Sargon of Akkad and Shulgi of Ur had done before him, creating a unified Mesopotamian state under centralized authority. But Hammurabi's methods and ideology were distinctly his own, shaped by the Amorite culture he came from, and by the political lessons learned from the failures of the earlier empires. Hammurabi's greatest legacy was his law code, the Code of Hammurabi, inscribed on a massive black basalt stele that stood over 7 feet tall. The stele was discovered in 1901 at Susa in Iran, where it had been taken as war booty by Elamite conquerors in the 12th century BCE. Today it resides in the Louvre Museum in Paris, one of the most important legal documents to survive from antiquity. The code consists of a prologue, 282 laws, and an epilogue. The prologue presents Hammurabi as chosen by the gods Anu and Enlil to bring justice and order to the land. It lists the cities he rules and the temples he has restored, establishing his credentials as a pious king devoted to the gods and to his people's welfare. The epilogue warns future rulers to respect and maintain these laws, threatening divine punishment for anyone who would alter or damage them. The laws themselves cover an enormous range of topics. Family law addresses marriage, divorce, inheritance, adoption, and sexual relations. Property law deals with land ownership, rental agreements, boundaries, and theft. Commercial law regulates prices, wages, contracts, and debt. Criminal law prescribes punishments for assault, murder, and various other offences. Professional standards are established for doctors, builders, and other skilled workers, with specific penalties if their work causes harm. The code is famous for its expression of the lex talionis, the law of retaliation, embodied in the principle, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. If a man destroys another man's eye, his own eye shall be destroyed. If a builder constructs a house that collapses and kills the owner, the builder shall be put to death. If that collapse kills the owner's son, the builder's son shall be killed. This seems harsh to modern sensibilities, but it actually represented a limitation on vengeance. Instead of blood feuds that could spiral into endless cycles of violence, the law prescribed exact proportional responses. You could demand equal harm to what you suffered, but no more. However, the code was not egalitarian. Different penalties applied to different social classes. There were 3 main classes in Babylonian society: Awalim, the property-owning class; Mushkinam, free persons of lower status; and Wardam, slaves. If an Awilim destroyed the eye of another Awilim, he lost his own eye, but if he destroyed the eye of a Mushkinam, he only paid a fine. If he destroyed a slave's eye, he paid half the slave's value to the owner. The principle of exact retaliation applied only within classes, not across them. The code protected social hierarchy even as it attempted to establish justice. The Code of Hammurabi was not truly original. Earlier law codes existed, including most notably the Code of Ur-Nammu, written over 300 years before Hammurabi. The laws of Lipit Ishtar and the laws of Eshnunna also predated Hammurabi's code. Hammurabi borrowed extensively from these earlier collections, often copying laws almost word for word. What made his code significant was not its originality but its completeness, organization, and the fact that it was carved on a massive stele and placed in public where people could see it and, in theory at least, know the laws that governed them. Modern scholars continue to debate whether the Code of Hammurabi functioned as actual law in the sense we understand it today. Court records from Hammurabi's reign, where they survive, rarely reference the code directly. Judges appear to have decided cases based on custom, precedent, and their own judgment, rather than by consulting specific written statutes. This has led some scholars to suggest the code was more aspirational than practical, a statement of ideal justice and royal ideology rather than a working legal system that judges actively consulted. Others argue that, even if judges didn't cite it explicitly, the principles it embodied would have influenced their decisions and shaped legal culture. The actual relationship between the written code and legal practice likely falls somewhere between these interpretations, with the code serving multiple functions, as practical guidance, as royal propaganda, and as a statement of cultural values. What is clear is that the Code of Hammurabi had immense symbolic and cultural importance. It presented the king as the source of justice, the guarantor of order, the protector of the weak against the strong. The stele's relief carving shows Hammurabi receiving the laws from Shamash, the sun god and god of justice, directly connecting royal law to divine authority. This image communicated a powerful message. These are not arbitrary rules invented by a human king. They are divine principles, revealed to the king by the gods themselves, and therefore carrying absolute authority. Hammurabi's reign represented the culmination of Mesopotamian legal development. The progression from oral custom to written law, from case-by-case judgment to systematic codes, from local variation to kingdom-wide standardization, all of these trends reached their fullest expression in Hammurabi's Babylon. While earlier Sumerian kings like Urnamu had pioneered law codes, Hammurabi perfected the form, creating a document comprehensive enough to address most situations that might arise in daily life. Beyond the law code, Hammurabi was an effective administrator. He maintained an extensive bureaucracy that taxed, surveyed, and regulated his kingdom's economic activity. He constructed canals and improved irrigation. He fortified cities. He patronized temples and supported religious institutions. His letters, many of which survive on clay tablets, reveal a hands-on ruler who involved himself in details of governance, issuing instructions to provincial officials, settling disputes, and coordinating activities across his realm. But Hammurabi's empire didn't long survive his death. His son Samsu-iluna inherited a kingdom already showing signs of strain. Cities in the south rebelled, trying to throw off Babylonian rule and restore independence. Kassites from the east began raiding Babylonian territory. Rival kingdoms that had been subdued during Hammurabi's lifetime sensed weakness and reasserted themselves. Samsu-iluna fought to hold the empire together but lost control over southern Mesopotamia. Later kings of his dynasty ruled over progressively smaller territories, until finally the first dynasty of Babylon ended when Hittites from Anatolia sacked the city in 1595 BCE. Yet even after the dynasty fell, Hammurabi's reputation endured. Later Mesopotamian kings saw him as the ideal lawgiver. The Kassites, who conquered Babylon and ruled it for 4 centuries, adopted Hammurabi's law code as their own. The Assyrians studied it. When Babylonian power revived in the first millennium BCE under native dynasties, those kings claimed to be restoring Hammurabi's greatness. Even the Persian conquerors who finally ended Mesopotamian independence respected Hammurabi's legacy, portraying themselves as his successors. The Code of Hammurabi appears to have influenced legal development far beyond Mesopotamia. Its principles show up in later Hittite law, in Middle Assyrian laws, and most controversially in the Hebrew Torah. The similarities between Hammurabi's code and the legal sections found in Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy are striking enough that scholars have debated the connection for over a century. Did the Hebrews directly borrow from Babylonian law during their time in Mesopotamia? Did both traditions draw independently from a common ancient Near Eastern legal culture? Could the similarities reflect parallel solutions to universal human problems rather than direct influence? The relationship remains contested, with different scholars emphasizing different aspects of the evidence, but few deny that some connection exists between these legal traditions. Hammurabi stands at the end of a long tradition of Mesopotamian kingship that began with the mythical rulers of the Sumerian king list and developed through thousands of years of historical experience. He was not Sumerian by ancestry, his dynasty was Amorite, but his achievement built on foundations laid by Sumerian kings. The concept of written law pioneered by Ur-Nammu, the administrative systems developed by the third dynasty of the imperial vision first realized by Sargon of Akkad, the religious ideology of divine kingship present from the earliest times. All of these Hammurabi inherited, refined, and expressed in his own distinctive way. In this sense, Hammurabi represents both a continuation and a culmination, the final flowering of a tradition thousands of years old, the last great expression of ancient Mesopotamian kingship, before the world moved on to new forms of political organization and new peoples came to dominate the Fertile Crescent. When we read the Code of Hammurabi today, we're not just reading one king's laws, we're reading the accumulated wisdom and experience of 40 generations of Mesopotamian rulers, all the lessons learned from Malulim to Hammurabi, distilled into 282 principles meant to govern human behavior and ensure justice prevails. The legacy and mystery of Sumerian kingship. As we reach the end of our journey through the reigns of these remarkable rulers, it's worth stepping back and reflecting on what the Sumerian kings collectively achieved and what mysteries about them remain unsolved. From the mythical antediluvian rulers who governed for impossible spans of time to historical figures like Hammurabi, whose accomplishments can be documented through contemporary records, these kings shaped human civilization in fundamental ways that still influence us today. The Sumerian king list itself remains one of history's most enigmatic documents. We can now read it, translate it, analyze it, compare it with archaeological evidence, but we still don't fully understand its purpose or how much weight to give its claims. Was it meant as genuine history, a sincere attempt to chronicle every ruler who had ever held power in Mesopotamia? Or was it primarily a political document, propaganda meant to legitimize later rulers by connecting them to an ancient, divinely ordained tradition of kingship? The answer is probably both, and more besides. The king list served multiple functions simultaneously. It was history, preserving genuine information about real rulers even when that information was distorted by oral tradition and religious belief. It was mythology, explaining the origins of kingship and its divine mandate. It was politics, supporting whoever currently held power by presenting them as part of an unbroken chain stretching back to the beginning of time. And it was theology, expressing fundamental Sumerian ideas about the relationship between humans and gods, about the nature of sovereignty, about how the world was ordered and maintained. The astronomical reign lengths of the early kings remain unexplained despite centuries of scholarly theorizing. Are they truly meaningless, pure mythology with no historical content? Are they based on some numerical system we no longer understand? Do they represent dynasties compressed into single figures? We may never know for certain, though each theory has its advocates and its evidence. What we can say with confidence is that kingship itself was a Sumerian invention, or at least was developed by the Sumerians to a degree of sophistication unmatched anywhere else at that early date. The very concept that one person should hold supreme power over a community, should command its armies, administer its laws, speak for its gods, direct its labor, and plan its future. This was not self-evident or natural to early humans. Many societies organized themselves differently, through councils of elders, through direct democracy, through decentralized leadership. The Sumerians chose centralized monarchy, and they made it work so well that the model spread across the ancient world. The divine aspect of Sumerian kingship is particularly interesting. Modern secular societies tend to see the divine right of kings as a cynical claim, a way for rulers to justify their power by pretending gods support them. But for the Sumerians, and for most ancient peoples, the connection between kingship and divinity was completely sincere. Kings really were seen as different from ordinary humans, as occupying a liminal space between the human and divine realms, as possessing qualities and authorities that came from the gods and couldn't be reduced to mere military strength or political cunning. This belief had practical consequences. It meant that kings had responsibilities to the gods that they couldn't shirk without risking divine punishment. They had to maintain temples, perform rituals correctly, uphold justice, protect the weak, ensure prosperity. A king who neglected these duties wasn't just a bad ruler in political terms. He was committing sacrilege, betraying his divine mandate, and could expect the gods to withdraw their support, leading to military defeat, crop failures, or other disasters that would end his reign. The Sumerian kings we've explored tonight achieved extraordinary things. They built cities that housed tens of thousands of people at a time when most humans still lived in small villages. They developed writing, transforming human communication and making possible everything that followed: literature, law, history, science, bureaucracy. All depend on the ability to record information in written form. They created legal systems that moved beyond personal vengeance towards systematic justice. They organized labor on massive scales to construct monuments that still impress us 4,000 years later. They established trade networks spanning thousands of miles, bringing together resources and ideas from across the ancient world. But they also failed repeatedly. Every empire they built eventually collapsed. Every dynasty ended, often violently. The administrative systems they created, while sophisticated, were also rigid and fragile, vulnerable to disruption from environmental change, external invasion, or internal rebellion. The centralized economies they developed concentrated power and resources, but also created bottlenecks and inefficiencies. Their conquests brought temporary unity but permanent resentment. Perhaps the greatest mystery is why Sumerian civilization disappeared as a living culture. The Sumerians themselves didn't vanish. They were absorbed into the larger Semitic-speaking populations that came to dominate Mesopotamia. Their genes survive in modern Iraqis, but their language ceased to be spoken by around 1700 BCE, surviving only as a scholarly tongue studied by educated scribes. Their distinctive cultural identity dissolved, merged into Babylonian and Assyrian civilizations that looked back to Sumerian precedents, while being fundamentally different. This gradual disappearance of the Sumerians as a distinct people puzzles historians because they were so culturally dominant for so long. They invented writing, they developed the first cities, they created the template for Mesopotamian civilization that everyone else followed. Yet within a few centuries of their political decline, they had ceased to exist as a living culture, remembered only in ancient texts and ruins. Scholars have proposed various explanations for this cultural dissolution. Some suggest it demonstrates that cultural survival depends less on original achievement than on ability to adapt to changing circumstances. The Sumerians created a brilliant civilization, but it was tied to specific environmental conditions, the agricultural potential of southern Mesopotamia's irrigated farmlands, and when those conditions changed, whether through soil salinization, climate shift, or political upheaval, Sumerian culture couldn't adapt quickly enough. The Semitic peoples, coming from different backgrounds with different social structures and different cultural flexibility, proved more adaptable and eventually became dominant. Others argue that the Sumerians didn't really disappear at all. They transformed. Their language died, but their ideas lived on. Babylonian and Assyrian cultures were deeply indebted to Sumerian precedents in law, literature, religion, architecture, science, and administration. The continuity was so strong that in many ways Babylonian civilization was simply Sumerian civilization speaking a different language. From this perspective, Sumer never truly ended. It evolved. The kings we've discussed tonight, from the mythical Elulim to the historical Hammurabi, were all trying to solve the same fundamental problem. How do you create and maintain order in a world that tends toward chaos? How do you get thousands or tens of thousands of people to cooperate for common goals? How do you resolve disputes fairly? How do you protect your community from enemies? How do you ensure your people have food, water, shelter, security? How do you create something that will outlast your own brief life? Their answers to these questions, the systems they built, the monuments they erected, the laws they wrote, the wars they fought, these shape our world still. Every time a government collects taxes and redistributes resources, it's following principles the Sumerians established. Every time a court applies written law rather than arbitrary judgment, it's continuing a tradition that began with Ur-Nammu. Every time we write something down and expect others to read it thousands of miles away or thousands of years in the future, we're using a technology the Sumerians invented. Every time we organize labor for major projects, we're applying management principles worked out in Sumerian bureaucracies. The Sumerian kings built civilization in the most literal sense. Before them, humans lived in small communities, largely self-sufficient, without writing, without cities, without specialized division of labor, without formal law, without monumental architecture, without empires. After them, all of those things became not just possible but normal, the expected framework within which human societies operated. They didn't do it alone, obviously. Thousands of scribes, priests, craftsmen, farmers, soldiers, merchants all contributed. But the kings provided the vision, the organization, the direction that turned human cooperation from temporary alliances into permanent institutions. Yet, for all their achievements, these kings remain in many ways mysterious to us. We have their names, their claimed lineages, lists of their building projects and military campaigns. But we know very little about them as individuals, as human beings. What did Gilgamesh actually think about death when he faced it, stripped of epic poetry? What drove Sargon to build an empire when he could have lived comfortably as a provincial official? What did Ur-Nammu hope to achieve with his law code beyond political legitimacy? What kept Shulgi going for 48 years of exhausting administrative work? What did Hammurabi feel when he realized his empire wouldn't survive him? We can't answer these questions. The ancient evidence doesn't give us that kind of intimate access to their minds and hearts. We have their public statements, their propaganda, their official ideologies. We don't have their private doubts, fears, hopes, or dreams. The Sumerian kings remain distant from us, visible only through the monuments they built and the texts they left, impressive but ultimately unknowable as complete human beings. Perhaps that's appropriate. Perhaps kings, by their very nature, sacrificed their humanity to their role. Perhaps the mask of divinity, the weight of responsibility, the burden of deciding questions of life and death for thousands, perhaps all of this transforms a person into something neither quite human nor quite divine, something in between, which is exactly what the Sumerians believed their kings to be. As we come to the end of tonight's exploration, I hope you found this journey into the distant past worthwhile. The Sumerian kings, whether mythical or historical, whether they ruled for 30,000 years or 30, all shared a common human quality, the desire to build something lasting, to impose order on chaos, to create meaning in a world that often seems random and uncaring. They succeeded in ways beyond their imagining. 4,000 years after the last Sumerian dynasty fell, we still study them, still marvel at their achievements, still try to understand the world they built and the world we inherited from them. If you found value in tonight's exploration, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Your support helps me continue creating these deep dives into history. Drop a comment below with your thoughts, questions, or suggestions for future topics. I read every comment, and your feedback helps shape the direction of this channel. Thanks for spending this time with me tonight, exploring the lives and reigns of the Sumerian kings. Until next time, sleep well, dream deep, and remember that every civilization, no matter how mighty, eventually becomes a story told in the dark, waiting for someone curious enough to listen.